Hello everyone, can I just check you can hear me? Can someone type in the chat box that they can hear me, please? Oh, someone's, uh, yep, you can hear me, that's brilliant. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to get started. Today's session is called Data Sharing, How, What and Why. I'm Isabel Chadwick. I'm one of the research support librarians. I don't have Maxine here, which is what it says on the slides. I've actually got Megan here today to help me. So she'll be monitoring the chat. If you've got any questions while I'm talking, please pop them in there and Megan will either answer them directly in the chat box, or if she feels that it's something that she needs to interrupt me for, then she will stop me talking and we'll cover the question that comes up. So please do just pop any questions you have during the session into the chat. And at the end of the session, we will have a bit of time for questions. And I think we might allow microphones at the end so that people can ask questions rather than typing them into the chat box. Just to let you know, we are recording this session. When we share the recording, we will remove your names from the recording, although the chat box will still be there and possible for people to see when they're watching the recording. And apart from that, I think that's all I have to tell you housekeeping wise. We've got 45 minutes. So let's get started. So before I move on to the subject of today's webinar, I just wanted to quickly flag up the Library Research Support website. So this is the OU's Library Research Support website, and it's a really, really useful resource for anyone who's doing research at the Open University, with information on open access, on research data management, on bibliometrics, on research visibility, things like ORCID, for example. And it's also got links to all of our training sessions, and we have started now uploading the recordings of our training sessions on there as well. So if you haven't had a look at this before, please do go ahead and have a look at it after today's session. A lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today are covered on the website in greater detail than I'm going to talk about them. So it's a really useful thing to go and have a look at. So what are we going to cover today? So first of all, I'm going to explain what we mean by data sharing. Then we're going to look at some data sharing policies, including the OU's own policy. We're going to think about what the benefits of sharing data are. We're going to look at some possible data repositories. And then we're going to think about how you need to prepare data for sharing. So what do you need to do to your data in order to enable data sharing with a wider audience? Okay, so first up, what is data sharing? In a very, very basic sense, it simply means giving other people access to the data that you collect during your research. So when we say research data, we mean the data that you collect or you use or you create during the course of your research. And that could be a really wide range of things. It could be videos, interview transcripts, survey, it could be tabular data, it could be images, and to each project, this will be specific and different. So while I'm talking, please think about what your data is and which parts of this workshop actually apply to your data specifically. So just quickly looking at this survey, which we in the library did back in 2018, so we're probably due to do another survey of this type on data sharing. Back in 2018, we asked researchers at the OU whether they have ever used other researchers' data, and found that actually about half of researchers who we surveyed did, and they accessed this data in a variety of different routes. So those routes might have been simply by asking the researcher or having worked with the researcher, or they might have accessed it directly online in repositories or from a link in a paper. So actually, data sharing and reusing other people's data is something that's always been done in different ways. But today in this webinar, we're going to focus on what is now accepted as the best practice for data sharing and what is being increasingly supported, including by the library at the Open University. So data sharing can be just that. It can be just, oh, hello, Jim, here's my data, have a look at it. But open data is the next level of data sharing, and that implies that discovery, access, and usability of data are increased. And usually you would do that by using a repository, data repository. So thinking about what best practice is when it comes to data sharing, data should be shared if it supports a publication or at the end of a project. So if your publication has any data that underpins it, it's really best practice to make sure that that data is available alongside the publication. And we would recommend that you make the data available at the same time or even before the publication is released, so that people can verify results when they're accessing your publication. The ideal is that your data is deposited in a trusted repository. And what we mean by a trusted repository is a repository that gives you a unique identifier for that data. So that would usually be a DOI or a handle. So that'd be a persistent unique identifier. It allows you to add metadata. So I've written here with metadata, and that metadata will inform any secondary users of what the data is, how it was collected, and how they are allowed to use it in the future. And it will be a repository that ensures that your data is preserved, and we always say for a minimum of 10 years. So 10 years is the Open University's policy. You should be keeping your research data that underpins publications for 10 years. And it's also the policy of most research funders. Your data should be discoverable. So that means that people are able to find it. It should be accessible, so that means that it's in a format that people can open, and it should be citable. And that means, as I've already said, that there is a persistent identifier that people are able to use to be able to cite your data. You should also be able to assign a license to it, and usually we would recommend that you use CC BY licenses. And on top of this, when you are publishing, you should put a data access statement into your publications, which give people information on how the underlying data can be found and accessed. And ideally, that would include your DOI or your persistent identifier, which is the link to your data in the repository. So I'm going to expand on all these points as we go through the session. But basically, this is the very best practice for data sharing. So now we're going to have a quick look at some data sharing policies. So a lot of research is funded by national and international funding bodies like UKRI, the Wellcome Trust for Cancer Research, for example. And when they fund work, they want to determine how the outcomes of that work is managed and shared. So, like open access for publications, many funders now have policies which require you to share the data you create during the work that they fund. Even if, when your grant was approved, there was no policy, check again as things are changing and new policies are coming out all the time. So even if you got your funding 5 years ago and there was no policy then, there may well be a policy now, and you are liable to actually follow that policy despite it coming into force after you first gained your funding. In addition to funder policy, we also have to think about the REF policy. So for the last REF, that included extra points for environment. So for example, this meant that the university would get extra points for providing data services and for going above and beyond the open access policy, which would mean that making underlying data available and having a data repository and a data management service was really important. And we can only expect that these requirements for the next REF will be even stronger. So getting into a good position where you are thinking about how you're sharing your research data at this point will really stand you in good stead for when we come to the next one. As well as funders having policies, publishers are also really beginning to come on board with data sharing, and many require that data underpinning research claims should be made available when research is published. So, for example, a research paper will feature a link to the data. Now, sometimes these publishers will provide a platform for you to share your data, but very often you will need to deposit your data in a discipline-specific or in an institutional data repository and link directly to it from the publication using a persistent identifier like a DOI. There are some publishers like PLOS have a data sharing platform that you're able to use, but many of them don't have this, and that's when you have to think about putting your data into a different repository, like the OU's repository, which is Ordo, or like a discipline-specific repository, and we'll have a look at those later. And then we also have the OU Research Data Management Policy, which was approved first by the Research Committee in November 2016, and there's just been a new version released in November 2021, which is very, very similar to the previous iteration, but now we refer to FAIR data in the policy. So FAIR data means that the data that you deposit in a repository should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which are some of the things that we've been talking about already in this session. And it also recommends that all researchers write a data management plan when they're producing or using data. So basically, the policy in terms of data sharing says that your data should be made open wherever possible, and that includes physical data, not just digital data. And this should be no later than the first date of online publication of research. Published research papers must include statements on how and what terms supporting data may be accessed, or if there's no data, the paper should make that clear. You should manage it responsibly throughout your project, so that means managing your data responsibly through your project, and that enables you to share your data at the end of the project, so that's really important. And the policy also states that the university will provide services and facilities, training, support and guidance to enable you to share your data. It's really important to remember that all those engaged in research at the OU, including those involved in collaborating with other institutions, must take personal responsibility for managing their own research data in accordance with university and funder requirements. So please do go ahead and have a look at that policy if you haven't done so before, and get in touch with me if you have any questions about it. Okay, so now we've had a look at the sticks for sharing your research data. We're going to have a look at some carrots. So we've got an appropriately orange screen here to think about some of the benefits to sharing your research data. And here we have quite a lot of reasons for sharing your data. So we can think about reuse, efficiency of cost, time and effort, being able to further research. Data sharing enables and encourages sharing of what didn't work. So not just your positive results, but also your negative results, so that other people don't repeat that experiment. It also enables others to better understand your work. It helps them to validate or replicate your work. And for the author, data sharing can lead to further reach and impact. You can consider it as another research output as well as your publications or your conference proceedings, for example. It really encourages rigor in working and preparing for someone else to see your workings. It's good practice. It means that your research is going to be of a higher quality because you're thinking about the quality of your data throughout. So the research itself is of a higher quality. And my final reason is who knows what someone else will make of your data. There's a really nice quotation, I don't know whether it's actually in this presentation, which is the best thing to do with your data will be thought of by someone else. So it might be that someone sees your data and has a completely innovative and radical new way of using it or building on it. So these are some really good ideas. Oh, here we go. The coolest thing to do with your data will be thought of by someone else. And going into a little bit more detail, here are some real world examples of the impact that data sharing can have. So first up, thinking about coronavirus. So open data is at the forefront of the battle to control coronavirus with the development and approval of vaccines in record time. The world has responded with unprecedented speed and mobilization of resources, and the pace of experimental work has been extraordinary. It seems unbelievable that we are at the point now where we've been vaccinated 3 times against what 2 years ago was a new virus. So it's absolutely incredible, and this is all down to data sharing amongst scientists. It's really fantastic. So the new virus was identified extremely quickly. The genome was sequenced and shared around the world within weeks. And if people had been sitting on this data and not sharing it, then I don't think that we would be in the situation that we're in now. So public emergencies are really pushing the open data agenda, and they're creating a new culture of doing research, which is really fantastic. So that's one really important reason for sharing your data. And we've called that one innovation. So our next reason is research integrity. And here's an example of from 2020. This is one of the country's foremost geneticists, and he was put under pressure to resign in early 2020 following investigations into fraudulent research practice in one of the labs he oversaw at UCL. So falsified research data was found in a number of research papers which were published during his time as head of the unit. And these included manipulated images, data fabrication and falsification, and it appeared to extend beyond an individual researcher. It seemed like there was a serious problem with the working culture in Latchman's lab. There were several researchers who were falsifying their results. Now, I would argue that if these data had been published in a repository with more opportunity for scrutiny, this level of fraud would be much, much harder to get away with. As it was, they were releasing their results without releasing the data, and that meant that this fraudulence went by for years and years before anyone realised that actually the data was, sorry, my phone's ringing. The data was falsified, which is pretty shocking. And then our final reason is gaining credit for all your work. So there is a personal benefit of data sharing to you as the researcher. The previous two were quite altruistic reasons to share your data. But as for a personal benefit, sharing your research data in a repository and archive will give you a DOI, which enables you and others to cite your research data. And that ensures that you'll have credit for all your work. And this can have a really beneficial effect on your career. So citability enables researchers to get credit for their data sets and to list them on job, tenure and promotion applications. Sorry, my other phone's ringing now. I hope you can't hear it. Right. So, of course, it's not always possible to openly share all research data. And the mantra that we sort of go by is that your research data should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So it's recognised that access to your research data may need to be restricted or managed in order to maintain confidentiality, to guard against unreasonable costs, to protect individuals' privacy, to respect consent terms, other security or other risks. So it is understood that there are exceptions to data sharing, and you really need to think about the research that you're doing and whether sharing your data would be more harmful than it would be beneficial. Okay, so now we know why you should share your data. Let's have. So there are a number of ways to share your research data. The OU has Ordo, which stands for Open Research Data Online. It's our institutional research data repository, and it's managed by the OU library. I'm the lead on managing this repository. So if you have any questions about it, please feel free to get in touch with me. You can use Ordo to store both live and archive research data. It's really best to use it to publish your research data rather than using it to store your data during your project, because it's quite clunky, the live research data storage, but it can be used for that. But it is fantastic for publishing research data. It's based upon the Figshare platform, which you may know as a platform which can actually be used for free by any researchers, but we have an institutional version of Figshare, which we call Ordo. And crucially, what this allows you to do is to create a permanent link, or DOI, for your uploaded published research data, which makes it easier to share with others and provides a means for others to cite and to link to your data, thereby giving you a proper credit for your work, as we just mentioned. We are looking at how we can integrate the research data added to Ordo with Ordo, so that your research data sets also appear on your staff profile pages. And that is really in the pipeline for 2022. So hopefully we will see that pretty soon, so that your research data sets that you put into Ordo will have the same status on your staff profile pages as your publications. So externally, there are also a number of options for repositories. And it may be that your funder has a repository which you're required to deposit your data into. So for example, ESRC has the UK Data Service. So a condition of their grant is that you put your research data into the UK Data Service repository. They also accept research data from other sources, so not just ESRC funded research. So if you are working with research data which fits into their bracket of social and economic research, then you may well be able to put it into there as well. And it's a really good resource. And actually the UK Data Service website is a really fantastic place to look for guidance on data sharing. And then there's also the NERC data centers, for example. So they have several data centers which are based on different areas of environmental science. So you may also want to look at storing your research or archiving your research in discipline-specific services before you consider Ordo. And that's fine. It's supposed to be there as a backup service. So in order to find discipline-specific research data repositories, a really good place to look is this website, which is on this slide here, re3data.org. That is a registry of research data repositories, and it has discipline-specific repositories. So these are a really good option if you are working in a specific area and you want other researchers who are working in the same area as you to find your data and to be able to access it more directly. But putting things into Ordo is also a really good option, because that ensures that you've got your DOI and your license and everything that you need. So in addition to the OU repository, the funder repository, and discipline-specific repositories, there are also several free online services that you can use, like Figshare, which is what Ordo is based on. And it's actually used now not just by institutions, loads of institutions have it as their data repositories, but it's also used by various journals to publish data underpinning research publications. And it can also be used as a data store, as I already mentioned. Zenodo is similar to Figshare. It's free to use. It was developed by CERN as part of the EU Open Air project, and it's aimed at the long tail of science. And there's a maximum threshold on Zenodo of 20 gigabytes per file, but you are able to include multiple files in one data set or collection. So that is another option. Then there's CCAN, which is another similar free-to-use tool. And it's also worth noting that there are now also a number of journals which specialise in research data, such as GigaScience or Biomed Central Research Notes. So they publish peer-reviewed articles which describe data sets for future reuse. So these are like data journals. And there are other journals which may allow you to link to your data stored in Figshare or Dryad. And finally, you can find possible, well, actually, I've already said this, you can find possible repositories to publish your data in re3 data. So there's more information on all of this on our website. So please do go and have a look at that. And if you have any questions, then please let me know. In terms of priority, I would say if we sort of have at the top of the pyramid, so the best place to put your data is in your funder's repository service. Underneath that, if there is a discipline-specific repository where you can put your data, that's the next best place to put it. The next best place to put it after your discipline-specific one is in your institutional repository. And then the next best place is these online data sharing services like Figshare and Ordo. So there's really a list of where the best place to put it is. And I like to think of it as a sort of pyramid. But obviously, the funder and the discipline-specific ones aren't available for all researchers. So in those cases, Ordo is a really good option. And here is Ordo. So I'm just going to briefly describe what it is and who can use it. We did a training session on this before Christmas, which was recorded. So if you are interested in learning more about it, then let me know and I'll send you the link to where that is. So anyone who is a research staff or doctoral students can use Ordo. We can also give permission to research support staff. So if there is some research support staff in your faculty who help you with who you want to help you with uploading your research data, then we can also give access to them, but you will have to request it. You can also invite external collaborating researchers to use the service. And you can use it to store and publish OU research data that supports original research activity. So the data store is intended to be used primarily as a research data store once a project has been completed, although it is possible to store live research data from in-flight projects there too, as mentioned. I'm not going to go into too much more detail about this as we have that recording available, but if you do have questions about it, then please pop them in the chat box and Megan can deal with them. Okay, sorry, I'm just going to have a drink and I'll carry on with preparing data for sharing. Okay, so when you are sharing your research data in a repository, what do you need to think about in order to make sure that it's in the best condition it can be? So you might be sharing your data for any of these reasons. It might be because you're supporting a publication, you might have come to the end of your project and you need to archive it. You might be supporting a presentation or a blog, or it might be that you're working on a longitudinal study and you need to archive your data at different stages of the project. So how do you determine what needs to be shared? A good way to think about what needs to be shared is considering which research data will enhance others' understanding of your research. Will this be understandable to others? Would they be able to replicate your results? So you might want to share your code or your methods as well as your raw data in order to enable better understanding and context. And depending on your academic discipline and the data type, what you share might vary. So it might be that you want to share raw data, but in some disciplines this might be totally inappropriate because it would be too vast, or it might just be completely meaningless to other people. And so in those cases, you might just want to share your derived or your analysed data. It could also involve sharing the code, as I've mentioned, or the software, or the methods, or the protocols. So it might not just be the data, it might also be this other stuff that enables people to understand and reuse that data. And it's really worth thinking about what data you should share in advance of when you're going to share it, and working towards it, keeping in mind the question, what would others need to understand my research? And what would you yourself need to understand it in 6 years, or in a year, or in 5 years from now? So it's best to think of this actually right at the very beginning of your project when you're planning data collection, so that you can think about how you're processing it and where you're storing things in order to enable data sharing, and in order to ensure that those data that you want to share are kept in a state that enables sharing quickly and easily at the end of your project. So it's really important when you're sharing your data to think about metadata and documentation. So make sure that your data are fully described so that anyone using them has sufficient information to understand their strengths, weaknesses, analytical limitations, and security requirements, as well as how to process the data. So adding context to your data means that there's less risk that people will misinterpret it, and it will also open up more possibilities for reuse, both by other people and by you. What is metadata? I hear you ask. Well, metadata is additional information that is required to make sense of your files. So it is what we often say, data about data. So what information is needed for the data to be read and interpreted in the future? Now, this could be at the project level. It could be answering these questions. For what purpose was the data created? What does the data set contain? How was the data collected, etc.? What types of documentation will accompany the data to help secondary users to understand and reuse it? This should at least include basic details that help people to find the data, including who created or contributed to the data, its title, its date of creation, and under what conditions it can be accessed. It might also include details on the methodology used, analytical and procedural information, definitions of variables, vocabularies, units of measurement, and any assumptions made, and the format and the file type of the data. And supporting documentation at a project level may include things like working papers and lab notebooks, questionnaire and interview guides, catalogue metadata, and it will probably include a README file that describes what data you have for your project. But there's also data that you will be metadata that you'll be storing at an object level, and this will tend to be embedded documentation. And by that I mean things like file headings in each individual file that you're creating, or it might be in the properties of the file. So on a Microsoft program, if you go to File and then you find the Properties bit, you can edit those details so that you can add more information about what's in there. And the kind of thing that we would look for in object level metadata or documentation would be code, field and label descriptions within your tables. It might be descriptive headers and summaries. And as I said, putting things into the document properties function of a file in Microsoft. So make sure that you're adding all of that contextual information, both at a project level and in each individual file that you are working with. And I mentioned this before actually because we've added the FAIR principles to our research data policy recently. So you may have heard previously about the FAIR data principles, and this acts as a framework for fostering and extending data sharing. And we now are seeking to integrate and promote these principles amongst our researchers. Now, using a repository like Ordo or like the UK Data Service will go a really long way to meeting these principles of making your work findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Now, another question about data sharing is, how do people find out that your data is there? How do you tell people about it? And there's loads of ways that you can tell people about your data. You could list it in your academic profile, which, as I mentioned, we're looking to automate for Ordo. You can put it in your publication lists, you can put it on your blog, you can tweet about it, but really the most useful way of telling people about your data is to link to it from related publications like your journal article, your conference paper, or your book chapter. So make sure that you are creating a data access statement, and this is a requirement of all UKRI funding, by the way, and that is included within your publication and that it links directly to your data. Now, the information on this slide that we've got here, and we will be sharing these slides, details how you can do this for openly available data and for data that is subject to access restrictions. And we will share these slides, as I've already said, so that you can look back to this. But also, when you're writing a data access statement, it's important to say if you don't have any data, as well as if you do have any data. So it's not just for data that is available, it's also for data that either doesn't exist or that is unavailable. And if your data is unavailable for legal or ethical or commercial reasons, then it's really important to write that in your data access statement. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to just quickly show you some useful resources, and then we'll have a bit of time for questions. And I'm happy to switch mics on if people want to put their hands up and ask questions with their voices, or you can just pop things into chat. So if you want to start thinking about any questions while I go through these resources, that would be fab. Okay, so how can we help you in the library? As I've mentioned several times, we've got Open Research Data Online, or Ordo, which is our research data repository. We can help you with data management plans, so we can help review them. If you're really struggling, we can help you to write them. We can also give you some advice on writing consent forms that detail data sharing in them. We can give you advice on preparation of data for sharing. We provide a lot of online guidance, so please do go and look at our website. And we're also here for any kind of inquiries. So if you do have any questions, please email them to the email address at the bottom of the screen here. And here are some useful links. So we've got the website, Ordo, some demo videos on how to use Ordo, a link to the Digital Curation Centre, which is a nationwide resource. So it's an organisation that talks about and educates on research data management and sharing. UK Data Archive, which I've mentioned. Mantra and Sesta Eric are both two training modules which are really good if you're just getting started with data management, and they have some practical exercises that you can do in order to learn a bit more about how you should be preparing your data for sharing, for example. So, does anyone have any questions? And Megan, if you could find the right link for the feedback form, that would be really helpful, because I forgot to change it on these slides.
I'll get it now.
Thank you. I see there's one person typing in the chat box, so I'll wait to see if that's a question. Aha. Should data for a pilot study be shared, even if it's not going to be published? I think it depends on what the data is and what the pilot study was. If the research is not going to be published, then there's no requirement for you to share the data. But if you think it would be useful for other people to have access to that data, then you could share it, as long as it's legally and ethically okay for you to do that. I hope that makes sense. It's not really a blanket question. It can be shared, but it doesn't need to be shared, I think is the answer. Are there any other questions at all? Sorry about the interruptions from my phone. Okay. I don't think there's any more questions. Megan has shared a link to our feedback form. It's really quick. It's just got 3 questions. So if you please could have a look at that and fill it in if you have the time. And I will also send that round in the email that I send later on today with the slides and the recordings. Our next research data management training session is on legal and ethical issues in research data sharing. So I will also send the details of that round, and I think that's in a month's time. So it'd be good to see some of you there. And apart from that, thank you for coming. Happy New Year, and have a great week, everyone. Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.